Evolution usually plays the long game. It hands out consequences slowly, quietly, over generations. But every once in a while, somebody speeds up the process by looking directly at a terrible idea and saying, "Yeah, I can make that work." Tonight, we're looking at 10 of the dumbest ways people have ever died. Not because they were unlucky, not because the universe singled them out, but because they treated basic survival instinct like an optional hobby. These are the moments when confidence beat caution, ego beat common sense, and physics showed up like an unpaid debt collector. Consider this your official reminder that warning labels are not decorative, gravity is not flexible, and industrial equipment is rarely in the mood for improvisation. Welcome to the Hall of Fame of Terminal Stupidity. Let's begin. 1. The open concept explosion. A quiet suburban Saturday is usually reserved for harmless disasters. A slightly burnt burger, a ladder wobble, maybe a tense argument in the garden section of Home Depot. For Gary, however, it became a full-scale architectural apocalypse. Gary was the kind of weekend warrior who watched home renovation shows the way medieval kings watched gladiator fights, loudly, critically, and with absolute certainty that he could do it better himself. Every licensed contractor on television was, in his mind, either overpaid, overdramatic, or both. Structural engineers? Cowards with calculators. Building inspectors? Enemies of progress. His latest obsession was the holy grail of modern suburban masculinity, an open-concept floor plan. Why should walls exist, Gary reasoned, when he could be yelling at a football game from the kitchen island without visual obstruction? Now, a rational person planning to cut through a major interior wall might check a blueprint, maybe tap around for studs, maybe locate electrical lines, plumbing, or the small detail of a gas pipe capable of turning a family home into a cautionary crater. Gary considered all of that bureaucracy for about half a second and dismissed it as weakness. He rented a heavy-duty demolition saw, the kind designed to chew through concrete and asphalt, and marched into his living room with the confidence of a man who had confused ownership with expertise. His wife, to her credit, begged him to call a professional. Gary scoffed. Because nothing says, "I'm the man of the house," like attacking load-bearing infrastructure with a spinning metal disc and zero planning. Now, here's the problem with walls. They aren't decorative cardboard. They're the internal organs of a house. Behind the drywall run electrical wires, plumbing, and, in many older suburban homes, natural gas lines under pressure. In other words, blindly cutting into a wall with a screaming industrial blade is less DIY renovation and more casino game hosted by Satan. Gary revved the saw, the windows shook, the engine screamed, and with the focused intensity of a man about to make a deeply teachable mistake, he plunged the blade directly into the center of the wall. The saw sliced through drywall, studs, and then into the main gas line. The pipe ruptured instantly. A pressurized jet of gas blasted into the room at the exact same moment the saw showered the space with hot sparks. There are many combinations in life worth exploring. That is not one of them. The gas ignited in a concussive blast that turned Gary's open-concept dream into the most literal version imaginable. The living room didn't just get an archway, it got sky access. By the time the dust settled, most of the house was gone, the neighborhood was in shock, and Gary had successfully removed every wall in the structure at once. The Homeowners Association later mailed a violation notice to what remained of the property. It cited exterior damage, which was technically true. Gary had wanted a more open home, and in the end, he got one, just not the kind with resale value. 2. The shortcut that invented the human pendulum. Laziness has inspired many great inventions: remote controls, elevators, online food delivery. Unfortunately, it has also inspired some of the worst engineering decisions in human history. Brad and Chad were college roommates living in 2 separate apartment towers at a university campus. Their buildings stood across from each other, separated by a narrow concrete courtyard roughly 100 feet below. This presented a small inconvenience. Whenever they wanted to hang out, one of them had to take the elevator down, walk across the courtyard, and take the other elevator back up. The entire trip took about 5 minutes. To most people, that's a minor inconvenience. To Brad and Chad, it was an unacceptable logistical nightmare, and like many catastrophes throughout history, the disaster began with the phrase, "Dude, I have an idea." Their solution was beautifully stupid. Instead of using elevators like normal human beings, they would build a rope bridge between their balconies on the 10th floor. No stairs, no walking, just a quick shimmy across open air like a pair of urban jungle explorers. Now, to understand how profoundly terrible this idea was, we need a quick physics lesson. When you suspend a human body from a rope stretched horizontally between two anchor points, the tension on the rope increases dramatically, far beyond the person's actual weight. The closer you move toward the center of the rope, the more force gets transferred to the anchor points holding it in place. This is why real rope bridges use industrial steel anchors and climbing harnesses. Brad and Chad used a frayed nylon rope from a discount hardware store. They tied it to the decorative aluminum railings of their balconies, using knots that can only be described as creative. Brad, being the smaller and lighter of the two, volunteered to test the system first. To everyone's mild surprise, he successfully made it across. He wobbled, he cursed, but he made it. Standing triumphantly on the opposite balcony, Brad celebrated like a man who had just disproven gravity. Chad, however, presented a slightly different engineering challenge. Chad outweighed Brad by about 80 pounds, thanks largely to a heroic diet of campus pizza and cheap beer. But success breeds confidence, and confidence breeds bad decisions. Chad climbed onto the railing, straddled the rope, and began scooting slowly toward the center of the gap. About halfway across, the rope started making a sound. Not a good sound. A thin, high-pitched groan, the mechanical equivalent of the rope whispering, "This was a mistake." But Chad ignored it, because when you're suspended 10 stories above pavement, turning back requires admitting the original plan was stupid. And Chad was fully committed to the bit. He kept scooting forward. Then the knot on his starting balcony gave up. Instantly. The rope snapped loose from one side, but it remained tightly attached to Brad's balcony, which meant Chad didn't simply fall. Instead, gravity turned him into a 100-foot human pendulum. His body swung across the open space in a wide arc, gaining speed with every fraction of a second. Brad watched in horror as his friend flew toward him like a screaming wrecking ball. Chad's spectacular aerial commute came to a violent halt when his body slammed face first into the brick wall of the building. The impact knocked him unconscious instantly. And unfortunately, unconscious people tend to lose their grip on ropes, which meant Chad's brief career in experimental balcony transit ended with a completely unobstructed 10-story fall to the courtyard below. The entire situation could have been avoided by one radical innovation: taking the stairs. History, however, remembers Brad and Chad for something much more important. They proved that laziness can, under the right circumstances, briefly achieve flight. Just not landing. 3. The tourist who confused a moped with a video game. Bryce had spent most of his life mastering one very specific skill: winning racing games. Hours of practice behind a controller had convinced him of something deeply unfortunate: that digital reflexes somehow translated into real-world driving ability. In his mind, beating his friends in a late-night gaming session meant he basically possessed the instincts of a professional motorcycle racer. This belief followed him all the way to northern Thailand. Thailand's mountain roads are famous among travelers. Long, winding routes through jungle-covered hills, breathtaking views, tight curves, and steep downhill drops that demand respect from even experienced riders. Bryce saw something else: content. Upon arriving, he immediately rented the cheapest scooter available, a small 125 cubic centimeter moped that had clearly survived several previous tourists with similar levels of confidence and similar shortages of skill. The rental agent handed him a helmet. Bryce waved it away. Apparently, protective headgear conflicted with the aesthetic of his vacation photos. Now, mountain riding follows a few extremely important rules. One of them is about braking. Motorcycles have two brakes, front and rear. The front brake provides most of the stopping power, but if you grab it suddenly while riding downhill, all your momentum shifts forward, locking the front wheel and turning the bike into something between a catapult and a physics experiment. Experienced riders know this. Bryce did not. He twisted the throttle and took off up the mountain. For the first few minutes, everything felt incredible. The air was warm, the scenery was beautiful, and the little scooter buzzed happily along the road like an obedient mechanical mosquito. Bryce felt unstoppable, which is exactly when gravity decided to join the conversation. At the top of the mountain road, the pavement dropped sharply into a long downhill stretch, ending in a tight hairpin turn carved into the cliffside. No guardrails, just a beautiful panoramic view of a rocky valley about 300 feet below. As the scooter rolled over the crest, gravity immediately took control. The tiny moped accelerated faster and faster down the steep grade. Bryce's confidence began to evaporate. The turn was approaching quickly, much too quickly. His brain, now operating in full panic mode, abandoned logic entirely. Instead of gradually applying the rear brake, the correct technique for stabilizing the bike on a downhill, Bryce grabbed the front brake lever with the terrified strength of a man trying to strangle a snake. The front wheel locked instantly. Physics did the rest. All of the scooter's forward momentum pivoted violently around the frozen front tire. The bike stopped. Bryce did not. His body launched over the handlebars in a graceful arc that briefly gave him the best view of the valley he would ever see. For a split second, Bryce achieved something remarkable: flight. Unfortunately, gravity remains undefeated. He landed far below among the jagged rocks at the base of the ravine, bringing his tropical adventure to a very abrupt conclusion. The scooter was eventually recovered by the rental company. Aside from some scratched paint, it was mostly fine. Bryce's family later received a bill for the damages, which proved one final universal truth about vacation rentals: the deposit is non-refundable. 4. The stunt that worked perfectly in the movie. Kyle had always believed one simple thing: if something looks easy in a movie, it's probably easy in real life. Hollywood action films had convinced him that running across moving cars, jumping between vehicles, and performing dramatic high-speed stunts were simply a matter of courage and good timing. In reality, those scenes involve professional stunt coordinators, safety harnesses, precision choreography, and insurance policies worth more than Kyle's entire life savings. Kyle had none of those things. What he did have was a smartphone camera, 2 friends with questionable judgment, and an overwhelming desire to become internet famous. The plan was simple. Too simple. Kyle would stand on the hood of a moving car and leap dramatically onto the roof of another moving car behind it. Just like the movies. The location was an abandoned industrial road, a long stretch of empty asphalt perfect for a stunt video titled something like, "Insane car jump, no fear." Kyle climbed into the passenger seat of the first car while his friend drove. Another friend followed closely behind in a second sedan. The cars accelerated to about 45 miles per hour. Now, here's where physics becomes extremely relevant. Standing upright on the hood of a moving car turns the human body into a large, unstable wind sail. Air resistance at highway speed pushes against you with enormous force, making balance extremely difficult. On top of that, car hoods are smooth, sloped metal surfaces designed to reduce wind drag, which means they are basically the worst possible surface to stand on. Kyle ignored all of this. He climbed halfway out the passenger window. The wind immediately slammed into him like a wall. His shirt flapped violently. His hair whipped backward, but somehow he managed to pull himself fully onto the hood, standing upright, 45 miles per hour, 2 tons of metal vibrating beneath his feet. Kyle struck a heroic pose for the camera. Then came the moment. He crouched slightly and prepared to jump. The plan was to leap backward onto the second car's roof, a perfect action movie stunt. There was just one problem. Kyle's sneakers were wet with sweat, and the hood of the car was polished metal angled slightly downward. The moment he pushed off to jump, his feet slipped. Not slightly, completely. Instead of launching himself gracefully through the air, Kyle lost traction and fell backward into the narrow gap between the 2 moving vehicles. The trailing car was only a few feet behind, and at 45 miles per hour, the driver had less than a second to react, which is not enough time for any human being to process the sudden appearance of their friend, falling directly into the road beneath their wheels. The result was immediate and final. Kyle's stunt video did eventually become popular online, But not for the reason he expected. Instead of a viral action clip, it became something else entirely. A permanent reminder that Hollywood stunts are performed by trained professionals, and that shouting, "Watch this," into a phone camera is not an acceptable substitute for physics. 5. The survival expert who ate the wrong plant. Todd considered himself a man of the wild. Not the casual, I go camping twice a year kind of outdoorsman. Todd believed he had unlocked the ancient knowledge of nature itself. Supermarkets, in his opinion, were for weak, domesticated people who had forgotten how to live off the land. He preferred the real thing: foraging, survival, primitive living. At least, that's what his website said. Todd ran small, wilderness survival workshops, where he charged eager city hikers a respectable fee to follow him into the woods while he explained how to identify edible plants, purify water, and reconnect with humanity's rugged ancestral roots. The students loved it. After all, Todd looked the part. Cargo pants, heavy boots, tactical knife on his belt. The confidence of a man who had watched every survival documentary ever made. On one particular Saturday morning, Todd led a small group of hikers deep into a forest trail. The lesson of the day was foraging, identifying plants that could safely be eaten in the wild. Now, real botanists will tell you something very important. If you cannot identify a plant with absolute certainty, you do not eat it. Because nature contains a fascinating variety of plants that look almost identical to edible ones, except some of them are essentially biological weapons. As Todd marched confidently through the forest, he suddenly spotted something growing near a muddy creek. Tall stems. Delicate, white, umbrella-shaped flowers. He grinned. "Wild parsnip," he announced proudly. To his students it looked convincing. He knelt down, grabbed the thick root, and pulled it from the soil with a flourish like a magician revealing the final trick. But Todd had made a very small mistake. The plant wasn't wild parsnip. It was water hemlock. And water hemlock is not just poisonous. It's widely considered one of the most violently toxic plants in North America. The root contains a powerful neurotoxin called sacutoxin that attacks the central nervous system with astonishing speed. Even small amounts can trigger seizures within minutes. Todd, however, had no idea. He brushed the dirt off the root and held it up proudly. "This," he said, "is pure natural energy." Then he took a large bite. His students watched nervously as Todd chewed enthusiastically, continuing to lecture them about the superiority of wild food over processed grocery store garbage. For a moment, everything seemed fine. Todd swallowed, smiled, and prepared to take another bite. Then the toxin reached his bloodstream. The transformation was immediate. Todd stopped speaking. His body stiffened. Within seconds, he collapsed violently onto the forest floor as uncontrollable seizures ripped through his nervous system. The terrified hikers scrambled to call emergency services, but water hemlock acts brutally fast. By the time help arrived, the self-proclaimed survival expert had become something else entirely. A cautionary example. The hikers eventually made it out of the woods safely, but they left with a lesson far more valuable than the one Todd had planned to teach. In nature, confidence is not the same thing as knowledge. And when someone claims to be a wilderness expert, it's usually best to make sure they brought a plant guide instead of just cargo pants. 6. The man who tried to hug a chimpanzee. Simon had a very specific belief about animals. He believed they loved him, not in the normal way people enjoy pets. Simon was convinced he had a special connection with wildlife, a kind of mystical understanding that allowed him to communicate with animals on a deeper emotional level. Unfortunately, the animals had never agreed to this arrangement. Simon had once worked briefly as an assistant animal handler at a private primate sanctuary. It didn't last long. His supervisors quickly discovered that Simon treated safety rules the same way some people treat parking signs, polite suggestions that were easily ignored. After several incidents involving unnecessary risks around large animals, Simon was politely but firmly fired. Most people would accept that as a sign. Simon saw it as proof that the sanctuary staff simply didn't understand animals the way he did. In particular, Simon believed he had formed a special bond with one of the sanctuary's residents, a massive alpha male chimpanzee named Brutus. Brutus weighed nearly 400 pounds and possessed the upper body strength of several professional athletes combined. Chimpanzees may look vaguely human, but biologically they are built very differently. Their muscle fibers are far denser than ours, giving them explosive strength that can easily overpower an adult human. They are also extremely territorial, especially dominant males. None of this discouraged Simon. Late one night, convinced that his friend missed him, Simon decided to pay Brutus a surprise visit. The sanctuary was closed, the gates were locked, and there were multiple signs clearly explaining that entering the primate enclosure was extremely dangerous. Simon climbed the fence anyway. Inside the enclosure, Brutus was quietly eating when Simon stepped into view. This was the moment Simon believed would prove everyone wrong. He walked toward the chimp slowly, with his arms open wide like someone greeting an old friend. And then he made the most critical mistake of the entire evening. He smiled. To humans, smiling means friendliness. To chimpanzees, showing your teeth is something else entirely. In chimp body language, bared teeth are a direct threat display. It means challenge, aggression, fight. So, from Brutus's perspective, a strange male had just broken into his territory and was now aggressively showing his teeth while walking toward him with open arms. There was only one possible response. Brutus accepted the challenge. The reaction was immediate. The enormous chimp launched forward with explosive speed, closing the distance before Simon had time to understand the translation error he had just made. What followed was not a heartwarming reunion. It was a brutal demonstration of why humans invented reinforced cages for large primates in the first place. Chimpanzees are frighteningly efficient in fights. Their strength, bite force, and instinctive aggression make them one of the most dangerous animals humans regularly underestimate. Simon's attempt at cross-species friendship ended exactly the way the sanctuary warning signs predicted it would. The next morning, staff members reviewed the security footage. The incident didn't lead to any new safety rules, because the existing ones were already extremely clear. Do not enter the enclosure, do not approach the animals, and under absolutely no circumstances should you attempt to hug a 400-pound territorial chimpanzee while smiling at it like you're in a Disney movie. Nature had already written the instruction manual. Simon just never bothered to read it. 7. The thief who robbed the wrong ingredient. Chester was not what you would call a professional criminal. Professional criminals plan things. They study security systems, watch surveillance patterns, and carefully prepare their escape routes. Chester preferred a different strategy. Impulse. Late one night, somewhere around 2 in the morning, Chester decided he needed money. Not a long-term financial plan, just the kind of quick cash that appears when someone opens a cash register and grabs whatever is inside. The nearest target was a small neighborhood bakery. It seemed perfect. Quiet street, dark windows, probably full of fresh bread, and a conveniently placed register. Chester pried open the back door with a rusty crowbar and slipped inside. The kitchen was dark and smelled strongly of flour and sugar, which Chester took as a promising sign. After all, bakeries handle money all day. He walked straight to the register, opened it, and found almost nothing. A few loose coins, some receipts. Apparently the owner had already emptied the register before closing. Most thieves would take this as a sign that the night's operation had failed and quietly leave. Chester, however, believed strongly in compensation. If he couldn't steal money, he was at least going to steal food. He wandered into the kitchen pantry, searching for something worth taking. That's when he spotted it. A large burlap sack sitting in the corner. Inside was a fine white powder. Now, in a bakery, there are several powders that look exactly like that. Flour, powdered sugar, cornstarch. Unfortunately, there is also another white powder commonly stored in kitchens. Industrial rat poison. Pest control companies frequently use powdered rodenticide in bakeries and restaurants. The powder is designed to look harmless, so rats eat it without hesitation. In low light, it looks almost identical to baking ingredients. Chester had absolutely no way of knowing which one he was looking at, but curiosity and hunger are powerful motivators. He dipped his fingers into the sack and tasted the powder. It was sweet, which, to Chester, confirmed his theory that he had discovered a giant sack of powdered sugar. Naturally, he grabbed another handful, then another. Standing alone in the dark kitchen, Chester began enthusiastically eating handfuls of the white powder, like a man who had just discovered the world's largest dessert topping. What he had actually discovered was a commercial-grade pesticide designed specifically to shut down the internal organs of rodents. Unfortunately, human organs respond to it in very similar ways. Within minutes, the chemicals began working their way through Chester's bloodstream. The first signs were dizziness, then nausea, then something much worse. By the time the bakery owner arrived early the next morning to start preparing dough, the kitchen was quiet. Chester was lying on the floor near the pantry, his face covered in white powder, looking, according to police reports, remarkably like someone who had lost a violent argument with a powdered donut. The investigation didn't take long. The burglary attempt had been unsuccessful. The thief had stolen nothing, except several handfuls of something that had been carefully labeled, "Do not eat." In the end, Chester had managed to achieve something very unusual in criminal history. He successfully burglarized a bakery and accidentally exterminated himself. 8. The man who declared war on his sink. Frank had a philosophy about home repairs. If something breaks in your house, there are only two acceptable solutions: fix it yourself or apply enough force that the problem stops existing. Hiring a professional plumber, in Frank's opinion, was an admission of weakness. Real men solve their own problems, preferably with tools, determination, and a healthy disregard for instruction manuals. The problem that started everything was small: a clogged bathroom sink. Hair, toothpaste, soap residue, the usual disgusting combination that slowly builds up inside pipes until the drain begins to move at the speed of a tired snail. Most people would handle this with a plunger, a pipe cleaner, or maybe a bottle of mild drain cleaner. Frank went in a different direction. He purchased a large jug of industrial-grade sulfuric acid. For those unfamiliar with sulfuric acid, it's an extremely corrosive chemical used in industrial processes. It can dissolve organic material, react violently with metals, and produce heat during chemical reactions strong enough to boil water. In other words, it is slightly more aggressive than typical household cleaners. Frank poured the entire bottle into the sink. The acid hissed and bubbled as it slid down into the pipes. Frank waited. Nothing happened. The clog held firm. Instead of reconsidering his strategy, Frank became angry, because if there's one thing that always improves a chemical reaction, it's emotional frustration. He grabbed a heavy-duty steel plumbing snake, a long metal coil used to physically break apart blockages, and shoved it straight down the drain into the pool of acid sitting inside the pipe. Now this is where chemistry enters the story. When concentrated sulfuric acid reacts with steel, it produces hydrogen gas and a tremendous amount of heat. Inside a confined space like a plumbing pipe, that reaction can become extremely violent. Frank, however, had not taken chemistry recently. He leaned over the sink to see what was happening. The moment the metal snake scraped against the acid-filled pipe, the reaction accelerated dramatically. The acid began boiling. Hydrogen gas built up rapidly inside the pipe. Pressure skyrocketed. And because pipes are essentially narrow tubes, the pressure had only one place to go: straight back up the drain. The plumbing system instantly transformed into something resembling a chemical cannon. The pipe exploded with a sharp crack. A geyser of boiling acid and corrosive vapor shot directly out of the drain. Unfortunately, Frank had positioned his face directly above it. The blast struck him before he had time to react. The sudden shock caused him to inhale sharply, pulling a lungful of superheated acidic vapor deep into his respiratory system. The damage was immediate. His lungs shut down almost instantly. As Frank staggered backward in shock, his boot slipped on the bathroom tile. He fell hard, striking the back of his head against the edge of the bathtub. The combination of injuries ended the plumbing project permanently. When investigators later examined the scene, the conclusion was painfully simple. Frank had set out to defeat a clogged pipe. Instead, he had accidentally invented the world's most aggressive drain cleaner demonstration. The sink was still clogged, but technically speaking, Frank had solved the bigger problem. He would never have to deal with plumbing again. 9. The man who tried to beat his own biology. Troy believed the human body had one major flaw. It gave up too easily. Troy was deeply invested in what he called biohacking, the idea that with enough discipline, training, and mental toughness, a person could override the limits of normal human biology. Sleep was weakness, pain was weakness, and the body's desperate need for oxygen, also weakness. Troy had recently become obsessed with competitive breath holding. It's a real sport called freediving, where trained athletes hold their breath underwater for extraordinary lengths of time. Professional freedivers train for years. They use safety teams, specialized breathing techniques, and strict safety procedures because pushing the limits of oxygen deprivation is extremely dangerous. Troy skipped most of that. Instead, he decided to train alone in his backyard swimming pool. Every night he would practice holding his breath underwater, timing himself and trying to beat his previous record. But there was one problem. His body kept floating back to the surface. This, to Troy, was unacceptable. Floating meant interruption. It meant having to tread water while his lungs screamed for oxygen. It meant he couldn't fully focus on pushing past his limits. So Troy came up with a solution. If the body wants to float, add weight. He walked into his garage and grabbed a 45-pound Olympic weight plate, the kind used in serious weightlifting. Then he found a length of heavy chain and a solid brass padlock. The plan was simple. Chain the weight to his waist, sink to the bottom of the pool, and stay there until he shattered his personal breath-holding record. Now, there are several problems with this plan. First, the human body's urge to breathe is not controlled by oxygen levels. It's controlled by rising carbon dioxide in the bloodstream. When that level climbs too high, the brain triggers an overwhelming panic response that forces you to breathe. Second, when you attach 45 pounds of iron to your body and sink to the bottom of a pool, swimming upward becomes extremely difficult. But Troy wasn't worried. He wrapped the chain tightly around his waist, threaded it through the weight plate, and locked it with the padlock. There was just one small detail he forgot: the key. It was sitting on the patio chair beside the pool, above the water, out of reach. Troy took a few deep breaths, stepped into the pool, and sank immediately to the bottom like a stone. For the first couple of minutes, everything was going perfectly. He sat cross-legged on the pool floor in what he probably imagined was a calm, meditative state of dominance over his own biology. But then the carbon dioxide started building. His chest tightened. His brain began sending urgent signals. Breathe. He resisted. That was the point of the exercise. Push past the weakness. Then the survival reflex kicked in. His body suddenly demanded air with unstoppable force. Troy tried to stand up, but the 45-pound plate held him firmly at the bottom. He struggled, pulled at the chain, looked up toward the surface where the key sat peacefully on the patio chair. But there was no way to reach it. The panic intensified. His lungs burned. His muscles weakened rapidly as oxygen levels dropped. And eventually, his body did what every human body does when deprived of oxygen for too long. It shut down. The next morning, the pool maintenance worker discovered Troy still sitting exactly where he had started, anchored neatly to the bottom. Technically speaking, Troy had succeeded. He had shattered his previous breath-holding record by several hours, which, unfortunately, is a record that's very difficult to celebrate. In the end, Troy proved something extremely important about the human body. You can try to beat biology, but biology always wins. 10. The influencer who tried to plug a volcano. Logan believed the entire world existed for one reason: content. Every mountain, every waterfall, every dangerous natural formation on the planet was, in Logan's mind, just another backdrop waiting to be turned into a viral video. Safety signs were not warnings. They were challenges. On one particular trip to a remote volcanic coastline, Logan discovered something that instantly made his eyes light up: a blowhole. Blowholes are natural openings in coastal rock formations that connect to underwater sea caves. When waves crash into the cave system below, compressed water and air shoot violently upward through the hole, sometimes launching massive columns of seawater dozens of feet into the air. They are beautiful. They are loud. And they are extremely dangerous. Most of the viewing areas around blowholes are surrounded by fences and warning signs for a reason. The pressure generated by the ocean inside those caves can be immense, turning the blowhole into something very similar to a natural hydraulic cannon. Logan saw something else: a stunt opportunity. His idea was simple. He would place his boogie board over the hole just as a wave came in, trapping the pressure beneath it. Then the ocean would blast the board upward like a cork popping out of a champagne bottle, and he would capture the entire thing on video. In Logan's mind, this was genius. In reality, it was an extremely poor understanding of fluid dynamics. Trying to block a blowhole is roughly equivalent to trying to stop a fire hydrant with a plastic plate. The pressure involved is not interested in negotiating. Ignoring the warning signs and the concerned shouts of nearby tourists, Logan climbed over the safety barrier and walked out onto the slick, black volcanic rock. The blowhole hissed quietly beneath him. He placed the boogie board over the opening and crouched down, ready for the moment. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, the ocean pulled back. Inside the sea cave below, millions of gallons of water rushed inward with the next incoming wave. The narrow volcanic tunnel compressed the force upward, building enormous pressure as it searched for an exit. That exit was directly beneath Logan. The water didn't care about the boogie board. It didn't care about the camera. And it definitely didn't care about Logan's content strategy. The pressure exploded upward through the hole like a cannon. The boogie board disintegrated instantly. Logan was launched into the air like a champagne cork. Witnesses later estimated he shot upward more than 30 feet before gravity rejoined the conversation. Unfortunately, he didn't land in the ocean. He came down hard on the jagged volcanic rock surrounding the blowhole. The impact ended his viral career permanently. The footage on his phone was eventually recovered, but the video never uploaded. Logan had hoped to become famous on the internet. Instead, he became something much more traditional, a warning sign. 10 people, 10 terrible ideas, and 10 moments where basic survival instinct lost a fight with overconfidence. None of these stories required bad luck, no natural disasters, no random accidents, just ordinary people looking directly at extremely dangerous situations and deciding the laws of physics probably didn't apply to them personally. Gravity disagreed, chemistry disagreed, and in several cases, the ocean itself had a very strong opinion. Now I'm curious. Out of these 10 spectacular failures, which one deserves the crown for the dumbest decision of all? The rope bridge engineers? The chimp hugger? The guy who chained himself to the bottom of a pool? Or the influencer who tried to plug a blowhole with a foam board? Let me know in the comments. And remember, if a warning sign exists, there's probably a story behind it.